Morning, everyone. My name's Wendy Hall, and I'm one of the assistant directors in the school, and I volunteered to introduce Bernie today. Hi, Sheila. Because Dr. Olaf is actually across campus talking to the UBC football team about men's depression, so he wasn't sure he could get here on time. So it's my pleasure to be introducing Dr. Bernie Garrett and his co-investigator, Dr. Tanya Tavner, and they're going to present to us on virtual reality and managing. Bernie's going to present on Tanya's behalf, and Bernie's background is as a nursing specialist, a clinical nurse specialist, and he did his PhD in information science, and he is one of our very famous associate professors and a very good colleague. So I'm sure he'll have very great things to say about his work and his research. So.
Thanks very much, Wendy. So welcome everybody for getting up early. Please help yourself to coffee and muffins and goodies over there. I'd like to give a shout out as well. I've got my research assistant, Murdad Gomi, over there to put your hand up and say hi, and our project manager, Crystal Sun. Now, we're using a lot of technology this morning, so things could go horribly wrong quite easily. So I've got more technology here, I'm sure, than most average airplanes have on, because we've got GoToMeeting running, we've got a VR set up, and we've got a slideshow, but we'll see what happens. The other thing is I'm going to do a little demo at the end if we get time, so I'll be looking for a volunteer. Obviously, we were hoping to run that for a bit longer, but there's a class in here at 9 o'clock, so we've got to be out of here by then. So if you're interested in, having an experience with the virtual reality yourself, Crystal's put her email up there. It's crystal.son@ubc.ca, and there's a sign-in sheet. Put your name on that if you can, and just email her, and she'll schedule you a go with it, so you can actually experience it, because it's very difficult to explain it without actually having a go with it yourself. So my title is Virtual Reality as an Adjunct Therapy for Chronic Pain, which is the application we're using within that domain of pain interventions, and a new frontier, smoke or mirrors. And the reason for that is there's a lot of new therapies sort of being purported for pain and used, and there's a lot of hype with the technology, as I'm sure you're aware. So is it all smoke or mirrors, or is there actually anything there? So I'm just going to go through this morning and discuss applications for VR therapies in pain particularly, and the work we've been doing, looking at particularly in chronic pain, but also we've done a rapid evidence assessment in acute pain, so I'll talk a little bit about that. A pilot project that we're undertaking to use virtual, which I undertook, last year to look at VR with chronic pain, and also an ongoing project we've got at the moment where we're looking at a randomized controlled trial with VR for chronic pain in cancer patients. But I'm also going to talk a little bit about other applications of VR for health. So what is VR? It's a good place to start and talk a little bit about it. There's a lot about it in the media. How many of you here have actually tried VR? A couple of you, yeah. My RAs don't count, so yeah. So yeah, there's a couple of you here. Good. So it's interesting. If we look at where we are today, we're very much in terms of media and multimedia. We sit in front of screens. That's what we're used to. We've been doing that for 100 years, yeah, and that's how we're used to interacting with media. It's fantastic. It's great. But we've always attempted to try and make that experience as real as possible. In our everyday lives, apart from when we're sitting in front of our computers or our TVs or our phones, we don't interact with two-dimensional spaces. We interact with things by touching them, moving around, and picking things up, handling things. That's what we evolved from doing and exploring. So our sense is very much geared up not to just staring at screens. Obviously, our visual input's very important. And there's been lots of attempts over the years to try and make an interface with art and with presentations, data that involves visualizations that are more sort of immersive, or what we call give you a sense of presence of being there. I mean, there's an early one here. This is 1881 from the Napoleonic Wars, the Battle of Borodino. And you can see that this was the first idea an artist tried to capture a panoramic scene by getting the whole view of the battle in one painting. So that was early. Some of you may have come across these as well. Moving pictures. We all go and see the movies. Anybody know what this movie is? It's Lumiere, and it was the first moving picture that, so, well, it wasn't actually the first, but it was one of the very first he showed in cinemas to show people the idea of moving images. So they moved from stills to moving images, and it's called Train Arriving in a Station. And the rumor has it that when he showed this in cinemas, it was so scary, people saw the train coming into the station and thought it was coming into the room and ran off and screamed. That apparently is a little bit of an urban myth, but people were a bit freaked out by it when they saw things, because you'd never seen anything moving before, and suddenly this huge screen, they saw a locomotive coming towards them. So it did. Before then, they just had things like camera obscura, with mirrors where they show the outside. So actually seeing moving images was quite something as profound as the technologies we're talking about in its day. So the moving picture, of course, is still with us today. Just had the Oscars announced. It's a massive part of everyday life. But you may remember these as well. Anybody had these as a kid? The old stereoscope? Yeah. So the idea then was to try and, if we look at, how reality is presented to us in cinemas, well, apart from unless you pay the extra money and go for a 3D cinema now, where the glass is, it's still flat and two-dimensional. So there was very early sort of moves to try and get stereo imaging, but it's very impractical to do. I mean, we all played around with these stereo masters when we were kids, and great fun. You can still get them now, where two images to give you binocular vision. And that moved on into head-mounted displays. You see the one, I like the one on the right with the little antennae from 1968 and 63, with these ideas of having two screens on your head. But you can see all this headgear is pretty bulky, particularly the later stuff. And so it hasn't really become mainstream. And for those of you who are cinema files from the 1990s, remember this movie? It was a terrible film, but Pierce Brosnan. It's called, if you didn't see it, that's good. It was pretty bad. It's called The Lawnmower Man. And it was in the 1990s and 80s, they started developing those big headsets and playing around with computers to do stereoscopic views through head-mounted displays in 3 dimensions. And the term virtual reality became sort of a commonplace phrase. And of course, the idea was then that in this film, he gets a lawnmower technician to actually inhabit a computer space. But the idea was that you could use computers then to render 3-dimensional environments which people could walk around and get a sense of presence and immersion in. The only problem with it in the 1980s, they didn't have the computer power to do it. So if you think of our old PCs back then in the 90s, and even really up till about 5 years ago, hi John, the computers just weren't powerful enough to run the visual rendering that you need to process that. Even now today, the machine I've got running the VR software here has got a top-of-the-line graphics card in it, so your average PC won't be able to run this. It really needs to be quite a high-end graphics processor, because it is a very computer-intensive, processor-intensive application. So that's the problem. But now the time has arrived where we've got, because of the exponential growth in computers and processing power, that we're now at the stage where processors are able to render 3D environments very rapidly and quickly enough for you to actually experience them in almost simultaneously. So we're now at this stage where we do have headsets that can work. You can put yourself in a 3-dimensional environment. So what is it like? Well, it's a bit like the film The Matrix. I can't actually tell you what it's like without you experiencing it. What is the Matrix? You only know what the Matrix is when you experience it. It's a bit like VR. I can talk about it, show you pictures of it, but unless you actually put it on, it's difficult to get the difference between, well, what does that binocular and 3-dimensional view with peripheral vision give you compared to just staring at a flat screen. And it's a totally different type of immersion. So I've got a little video I'm going to play very quickly here. Sorry if you're online, and this may not work quite so well in the GoToMeeting, but this should show you an idea of how VR works. And what they've done quite cleverly, they filmed it in a green screen, and then they projected what the user's seeing on the green screen on the outside. So what you see going around the user, person with a headset on, is what they're seeing. So let's give it a go.
Oh.
Wow. That's very green.
Ooh.
Come on in.
So we're going to show you some virtual reality today. You know, it's really hard to show people what it's like to be in virtual reality without having them try it for themselves. Filming you in the green screen studio is just the best way we found to help everyone else understand what it's like to be in VR. Any questions?
Can I go first?
All right, go crazy.
Aw, you're so cute. Oh, hi, Lucian. Oh. Hey, I have a stick now. Come here. You want the stick? Yeah, go get it. Oh, he actually gets it. Come on. Oh, you're so cute.
It makes you feel like you're pulling a string back. Left, check left. Oh yeah! Nice shot.
Oh my goodness, these guys are so cool.
Look behind you, Kyra.
Order up.
Bacon? Oh no.
Is that how you cook for your family at home, human?
It's burned.
Eat those donuts, Travis. Get them. Get those donuts.
Don't stand in the way of his ball. A little bit more toward us. There you go.
No, the other way, the other way. The wheels are a little off kilter.
Hold on. I'm gonna get really hungry down here. Little bit of a torque issue.
Yeah, there you go.
Right into the black hole.
What? Can we go into space?
No, I can't. The grid's here.
The grid wall here, that's to stop you from walking into the couch, walking into the walls.
Oh, this is so cool. I can move all this stuff.
Look at this thing.
Yes.
So you gotta keep with the beat.
Got him.
Can you see me?
Yeah, hold up some fingers. Let me see it. 5.
Oh my god! No, use both of your hands, Kelly.
Oh. You have a little fire. Oh, I think it feels hot. I'm pretty sure I feel.
But you get the idea. You're actually interacting with what's around you. It's three-dimensional. It's in 360 degrees, so you can walk around, you can see stuff all around you and interact with it. And you can see on the floor there, we've marked out an area, and that area between these two poles, which have a little laser scanner on the top of each one, maps where you're moving within that area. So it tracks you where you're moving and projects into your headset a view that you would have if you were in a real world working like that. So you can imagine the amount of processing it's taking to do that. So the big thing about VR now, I'm sorry the video didn't work so well, but the big thing about it is what is different about it. It gives you a totally different sense of presence than you can achieve sitting in front of a computer monitor. So it's very easy to fool the human brain. Remember our example of Lumiere at the start with the train coming in the station. You know, people see something coming towards them and our natural instincts are to, jump out the way of it because it's scary. So all you have to do, if you wrap that into a 3D display so that you're actually visually wherever you looks realistic, and then you give yourself some hand controllers that show where your hands are doing, which is the other thing these new VR implementations do, your brain automatically puts you in that space and you feel you are somewhere completely different. And it's that sense of presence that's pretty important. So this, we're just starting to look at health applications for this. And one of them, where the key area, probably the front runner for VR research in terms of health applications currently, is in pain research. And as we know, chronic pain particularly is a very challenging area for healthcare. We don't manage it particularly well. We usually end up resorting to opiates in long term. And we can see the statistics here are pretty grim, with 1 in 5 Canadians suffering persistent pain. And only 30% of ordered medication is given. 50% of patients are left in moderate to severe pain after surgery. All these, problems with pain management, which we're well aware of as nurses in our own practice. And so how can VR help with this? Well, VR environments are hypothesized to reduce pain from a couple of mechanisms, and we're not quite sure exactly which one's working, and that's where a lot of the research is going on, some of the work we're doing, but probably through distraction, and there may be other mechanisms where they work as well by altering the way in which our brain is wired. And particularly with some of the experiments that are being done with meditative and mindfulness type practices, where VR can be assistance in that to help patients focus on sort of their own well-being rather than being sort of focusing on their pain. It's very difficult because we don't actually know at the moment what the precise mechanism is that VR actually attenuates pain, but we do know it does have quite a profound effect, more than other distracted therapies, possibly because of this massive amount of immersion and presence. So we did a review a couple of years back how I got interested in this, as I was reading some work by Dr. Hunter Hoffman over in Seattle, who's got a VR lab there working with burns patients. And I talked to my colleague, Dr. Tanya Taverner, who's a pain specialist and is an adjunct professor here with UBC, and talked about, should we have a look at this and was it worth exploring? So we did an initial rapid evidence assessment to see where VR was being used, and this was about 3 years ago. And we actually got some small amount of funding and then did this rapid evidence assessment, which, if you're not familiar with, a rapid evidence assessment is a very quick, it's like an environment scan, but it's actually a bit higher than a narrative review or a quick scoping review. It sits in the middle before a full systematic review. Basically, you have a series of 4 tools that you apply to the literature. You go out and look at the literature, say, over 5 or 10 years, and you apply these 4 tools to assess the literature for the quality and weight of evidence. And that includes a Cochrane risk of bias tool assessment as well. And it includes both qualitative and quantitative work. And so we did that, and we came up, we published a paper in the Journal of Clinical Pain, and basically looked at particularly how VR was being used in acute pain. And it's quite interesting. There wasn't a lot around. There were 17 studies. And we were asking what sort of VR experiences, if any, have provided effective adjunctive pain therapy. What's the overall evidence of the value of VR in treating acute pain? What VR hardware is required, and what applications does the research show present the best efficacy for pain management? And particularly important, are there any adverse effects, side effects? So that was what we sought to look at. We ended up looking at acute pain simply because there wasn't anything on chronic pain at that time, 0. There was 1 study being undertaken, but it was pretty small. And as I said, there were 17 papers that we found, research studies, 5 RCTs, 6 randomized controlled trials, 6 randomized crossover studies, and 2 case series. So pretty small studies at the moment. Part of the problem with that is the cost of doing this work. It isn't cheap to do. 1 VR headset is $1,100, and then you need a computer, which is another $2,000 to be able to run it. So it is expensive to do. But overall, there was 337 patients who participated in studies with VR. But unfortunately, only 4 had a low risk of bias. So if we looked at the results from that, sorry, that's a bit small, that's the table comparing them, we found that the risk of bias was quite high in some of the studies, medium in others, mainly because of the way they recruited the samples and possibly the experimental design. But having said that, again, if we look at the cited studies, they're pretty small numbers. Most of them, the biggest one had 58 in, most only had sort of 10 or 11. So overall, evidence was not hugely strong, but all of them were reporting similar things. Most of them used a computer-rendered 3D environment, as we've been discussing. There are other ways of doing VR, for example, projecting on walls that you walk around in a room, but that's massively more expensive. So most of them were using headsets. 3 used two-dimensional commercial computer displays with similarly equipped head-mounted displays. And this is the interesting thing. When you see the term VR used, it's often not actually VR that people are doing. Has anybody seen those 360 photospheres where you can sit in, you can put a goggles on and see a 360 view of a scene? Now, they're very impressive, but they're not totally VR simply because they're basically two-dimensional. So you can get a camera, the 360 cameras now, you can buy one in Staples for a couple $100 and take a 360-degree view of a room. For example, realtors use them quite a lot. Yeah, you've seen that on realtor sites where you can move the mouse along to look around the house, those sorts of things. Now, they're great because you can see what's around you, but they're not totally VR simply because they are two-dimensional and they don't have an audio component as well. Another important part of VR is not only the visual representation around you, but stereo audio. If you hear a bird twittering over there, your brain tells you where's the noise coming from. You look over there, you know where it is. If you walk over there, you expect that to move. Yeah, it doesn't stay in the same place. And so all VR computer-generated environments, proper VR, have three-dimensional audio, so that where you have the object, the sounds come from spatially that area. So there are things that are VR and are things that aren't technically. So some of these studies we came across weren't technically VR, but most of them were. 8 of the studies used the Snow World environment designed by Hunter Hoffman's research team down in Seattle in his HIT lab. It's called Human Interface Technology Lab. And he's really quite a pioneer with this sort of work. He's basically a technologist, but he's working with some burn specialists down there, and they were particularly using VR for changing wound dressings on burns patients, which of course is one of the most painful things possible to do in terms of clinical procedures. And so he was having good effects with that by putting these people into a cold, snowy environment. So while they're having their dressing changed, they're throwing snowballs at snowmen in an icy environment. So quite an interesting way of doing that. As an example of it here. You can see it was quite simple because it's going back a few years, but you can see the snowman and things like penguins pop up and you have to throw snowballs at them and stuff like that, which is quite distractive, but also totally gives them the opposite of the pain they're getting from their burns dressing changes. So most of the studies included pediatric and adult patients with pain resulting from acute and subacute conditions, and burns and wound dressing changes. Dental procedures were the main ones. And so for acute pain, even though the weight of evidence wasn't strong, there was strong overall evidence for immediate and short-term pain reduction. So we are getting effects that are better than placebo and quite significantly better than placebo, and also quite a lot better than other distractive therapies such as watching a video or playing just a computer game, which have been trialled alongside VR. So it does have a more significant effect. Moderate evidence was found for short-term effects on physical function. So interestingly, there have been some studies that have reported people's function improves after VR experiences, particularly mobility. We've had a couple of cases, and one of our own participants in our own work reported that after using the VR, where they're moving around freely within the VR, they found their actual movement where they had restricted mobility before was slightly improved, which is very weird. We're not really sure why that is. But again, it's obviously a neurological issue with them actually, because they have been able to move and felt free to move, then that's actually sort of translated across to their everyday life. And interestingly, there's some work going on with phantom limb pain at the moment, which is also proving quite useful in terms of VR, where they can see a limb in the VR world and they can see a limb and move it around. That translates afterwards into a reduction of their phantom limb pain. And there's a couple of studies that have shown that it's quite effective tool for that. But little evidence for any longer term effects. So things aren't, you take the VR off and it doesn't seem to last much longer. Side effects. Well, there weren't any serious adverse events, but there is this thing called cyber sickness, which is a type of motion sickness. And this is a problem for VR developers that they're not particularly keen to acknowledge at the moment. So what we tend to find is if you stick a headset on and you're sitting in a chair and the headset showing you're walking around in a beautiful forest or something, your visual cortex is getting the information that you're moving around, whereas your inner ear and your vestibular apparatus is telling you you're sitting in a chair. Now that conflict causes quite a bit of motion sickness in some people, and it is something that we've noticed. So there's two main problems with VR I've noticed from my experience of it the last few years, and the research studies are reporting. One is motion sickness, which they're now very keen to try and look at ways to get round. And two is eye strain, because you're focusing on something that's actually literally 2 centimeters in front of your eyes. After about 30 minutes, your eyes begin to ache a bit, even though you look like you're moving around. So those are two areas, but they're not serious adverse effects. Although having said that, I had one patient who was particularly susceptible, unfortunately, in one of the early trials, who had to lay down for 3 hours after trying the VR because they felt nauseated and had vertigo for 3 hours. So some people are very susceptible to it. Most people acclimatize pretty quickly. If we've looked, there's been a lot of newer studies since 2014 to 16 to 13, 4 examining chronic pain, 3 in progress, 1 of ours, 1 examining spinal cord injury and functionality, 5 examining pain in medical procedures such as cystoscopy, dressing changes, episiotomy, and 3 examining functionality with limb pain, and one of those is with fibromyalgia. And several other studies using VR with artificially produced pain. There's quite a few of those where they have people who don't have pain, who they put a clip on their hand to reduce pain and then put them through. But the trouble is with those, as we know, artificially induced pain isn't anywhere near the same as real pain, particularly chronic pain. So we've started to work with chronic pain because this is an area where there wasn't much research. So we started off with 10 adult patients with chronic pain, and we recruited them from Pain BC and a couple of the other pain support networks in BC. And initially, this was a very exploratory study we did just to try and use as a basis to get more funding. And we gave each of them a VR setup in their own home and asked them to use it for 40 minutes every other day and recorded pre and post pain scores with established pain assessment tools. The hardware we used at the time, this was a couple of years back, when we started this, was the Oculus Rift development kit, because again, it wasn't commercially available, so we had to get an early version, which did have its headaches. So it had a 100-degree field of view, so your field of vision was 100 degrees, 110 degrees, which is quite wide, and a high-end PC like this running a graphics card that would support it. And we purchased 3 units and rotated patients through them. And in 4 weeks, we selected 4 different environments. 2 of them were aimed at introspection and basically mindfulness, meditative type approaches, which were theorized via, the theory suggests, improves people getting into that state quite quickly, which then helps them manage their pain and reduces their focus on the pain. And in the other 2 weeks, we had them doing applications which involve cognitive problem solving, puzzle solving. Okay, so in this case, they go and have to find their way out of a puzzle, solve a puzzle to move the next level of a game in a VR environment. So, or explore and find things in an environment. So, for example, Ocean Rift is a diving game where they're swimming underwater and they have to go and find things, discovering spaces, exploring the solar system. So we had basically 2 types of intervention. These basically the introversion, introspective mindfulness type ones, and then the cognitive ones to compare the results. We had to create user-friendly menus so people could easily do this, and we were a bit concerned, setting this gear up in people's homes, was it actually going to work? Because it's very early on. It's hard enough getting it set up in a lab sometimes. Amazingly, it did work. It has reached the level now where it's robust and reliable enough to use in people's homes. And the sequencing of the experiences was designed from simple to complex, with use of similar experiences in each week of the study over the month. So there's an example of the menu. I won't bother giving you that. There's a video of one of our patients trying it. He's given permission. He's quite happy for that. Look behind you. So this gentleman's very first time he's tried VR. He's got an Oculus Rift headset on. And one of the first things you have to tell people to do is look around them, because they tend to stare in front, because that's what we're so conditioned to do with VR. You stare in front of you at a screen. And the thing is, a lot in VR, a lot of the stuff behind you or around you have to move around behind it. And he's sitting in front of a desk in this example here, and he's simply using a game controller to move around. But now he's in Iceland, so he's going through a canyon in Iceland, and you can see the two images there are the stereoscopic ones. So on the computer screen it's just mirrored, so you can see what he's seeing, but he's seeing actually a three-dimensional image as he walks through it. And this was one of the more relaxing environments. It was very calming, travel through Iceland, and there's animals that roam around, things like that. So generally people find they adjust to it pretty quickly. It's a bit strange having a headset on to start with. And of course, if you've got any neck pain or sort of limited mobility, that may affect your ability to use VR. You can see as he moves around, what's in the screen moves around as well. Now he's going over a waterfall. You can move up to another one there. This is another gentleman. And you can't see what he's looking at in this one, but he's in a villa in Tuscany, and he's looking around, exploring a villa. You can just hear bird song, and it's a nice warm summer's day. And so you can see he's looking around, seeing all the environment around him. So you can imagine, as we start to look at these things, being able to place someone in an environment that you've custom designed for a particular purpose is quite a powerful tool. Imagine someone sitting in an ICU bed, surrounded by, ICUs are the worst place in the world to be stuck because you've got bleeps, alarms, monitors going on, people walking back and forth, it's really noisy. They're not restful environments, and that's a lot of patients complain all the time, we know that. So if you could stick something on them that puts them in a tranquil meadow somewhere where they actually, feel or somewhere from their own past that they like, then that becomes quite a powerful tool. But there are other therapeutic ideas where you could use it as well, but because you control the environment 100%, what's going on with it. Anyway, let's have a think about some of the issues that we experienced when we were doing our work with these patients. Users' hardware limitations, that wasn't actually such a big problem, but the problem we hoped to run these on people's own machines, their own computers, their laptops or PCs, and it's just not going to do that on 90% of people's home PCs. So we ended up buying our own machines to put in their homes. Technical knowledge, skills, technology, that wasn't a big issue. As long as the people were able to use a mouse and basically navigate a menu system, that's pretty easy. Hardware, software failures or damage, that wasn't a big issue. We had a couple of sound cards that went wonky, but apart from that, everything worked very well. Unpredictability of users, as with any in vivo study that you get, users don't always comply with what you want them to do. So we'd locked down the machines pretty well so they couldn't go off browsing the internet or whatever from the machine, but they still managed to, upset things by doing things their own way. For example, if they found one particular game they wanted to play, they'd go back and do that rather than the protocol. So we had to work around that in a couple of cases. And dropout was an issue as well, and tolerance of cyber sickness. We only had 2 patients drop out from cyber sickness because they found motion sickness affected them. But we had others with this population, chronic pain sufferers. They have an awful lot going on in their life. They're all on opiates, all of these patients were. And so we did have a few drop out. But we managed to get them through the study, and we used a part-time research assistant to act as a tech support for these. And Cool averaged about 1 hour a week to support them. So it wasn't as bad as we thought in terms of supporting people at a distance using this technology. Dropout was significant, as I've said, 30% overall, and we had to plan for replacement of those within the study. And some completed but didn't comply, so we had some missing data in a few cases as well. So what did we find? Well, chronic pain, there was some quite good evidence from those who did participate for immediate and short-term benefits. We did have alteration in pain scores. The problem is, the main problem we've got with VR, most pain scores, as you're aware, require people to fill in a form of some sort or a numeric score, a visual analog pain score, 0 to 10, we're all familiar with. You have to actually say which number. That's fine if you're sitting at a desk or something. If you've got a VR headset on and you're in the middle of a VR experience, if I want to ask you what your pain is in that experience, it takes you out of it. You've got to take your headset off to fill in the form. So doing pain scores within the VR experience is quite tricky. So we couldn't really do it at this study. We are working on a way of doing that now in the next study we're doing. So they're mainly before and after scores that we were using. We did find a couple of people reported short-term benefits on physical function, but there were no evidence of any longer-term benefits. So some studies are reporting that. We didn't find that. And that is basically there was a reduction in pain and distraction quite significant when they're using the VR, but as soon as they take it off and within half an hour, it's not making any difference longer term. So that was quite interesting in itself. So evidence for VR use for clinical pain control, still very immature, but as an adjunctive intervention in the management of acute pain, it appears to be growing, particularly with burns related. We do know that the wide, as I said, there's a lot of things claiming to be VR, but the wide field of view stereo headsets seem to promote the best sense of presence, which is the key thing you want to actually act as a distraction or assist people in managing their pain. And also, we're starting to see an interest in VR for other health applications, which I'll talk with briefly at the end. But there are still some side effects that we need to work out. Cyber sickness is one of them, and that's the main one. The game developers and people selling VR equipment aren't being particularly keen to highlight, but it is there. The good news is it's actually something that people get used to quite quickly and can actually tolerate very shortly. After they've had a few goes with the headset, it's pretty much settles down. And there are some applications that are worse than others. Obviously, if you choose a roller coaster ride from hell, you're going to get motion sickness, and there are a couple of those that we've tried that really do have strong buff factor. But there are others that, where you're walking around quite quietly, that in a meadow or something, that no problem at all. The other thing that's changed is when we did our study, it was a sitting one, and the equipment now is actually walking. So you walk around an environment. And that makes quite a big difference because you don't get the same amount of problem with disjunction between what you're seeing and what your vestibular apparatus is telling you. So the new walking VR implementations are much better. We're not seeing so much. Okay, so what are we doing now? Well, we're taking a larger prospective RCT study with Simon Fraser University. And we got funding for that, and we've got a 3-year study. We're going to put 50 patients through a VR experience compared to 50 patients using exactly the same software but in a 2-dimensional screen. And they're going to be doing it 30 minutes every day for a month. And we've got 2 conditions, mindfulness and cognitive applications to compare. Because one of the interesting things we found in our pilot work was some people really like the mindfulness stuff, and they find that really helps. That does help them control their pain and settle them into a state of mind where their pain is manageable. Others hated it. They really didn't like it. They really did not like sitting in trying to meditate, and they didn't find that helpful. That just increased their stress. And so they preferred the cognitive applications where they were distracted by solving a puzzle, 3-dimensional puzzle or a maze or something. So we've got 2 types of condition we're going to be trialling, and we've got 2 groups, a VR group and a multimedia group as a control. So we're at the stage now where we're just moving into recruitment on that study. So other applications for VR, before I very quickly show you a demo at the end. The technology's advancing very rapidly. It's one of those technologies that sort of basically is hard to keep up with every week. There are still predominantly recreational uses. Other uses of VR are starting to come online, such as educational, training uses, and possibly also other sort of things like risk assessment and type of activity simulation. But we're also starting to see rapid development environments available for VR now. There's 2 out there, Unity and Unreal. That means you can rapidly create a 3D environment very quickly with pre-built if you like, blocks that you can put in and build. if you want to build a forest environment, an urban environment, whatever, you can do that quite quickly with these tools, which makes the whole process a lot quicker. And there's still lots of hype. You've probably seen Google Glass, remember that? Still not really out there yet, is it? And the latest one is the HoloLens, Microsoft. You've seen the sort of film on that. But we are starting to see some other applications. This is an interesting one. This is some fitness studios are starting now buying this gear. It's a flying simulator where you wear VR goggles and you fly, but to move, you have to actually physically move your body. So it's an exercise machine. So you can actually fly in 3 dimensions, but it's a workout as well. So there's some stuff like that that's going on. Okay, I'm going to do a quick demo. So we've got a VR setup here. It's a very, very peaceful, calming VR setup, so don't get too worried if you're thinking of having a go, but a bit concerned what it might be. It's actually one of the ones that was shown in the film clip earlier. It's an Iceland environment, and there's a robot dog that walks around that you can throw sticks for. So I'm just going to bring it up, and while I do that, feel free to ask any questions.